Captain Elias Kane stared out the viewports of the ship, his mind racing. The planet below was engulfed in chaos, a battlefield where hundreds of soldiers clashed under the burning sun. War had torn apart the fragile planet, leaving only ashes and blood in its wake. But the mission wasn't about the war. It was about someone who needed saving. Yara, the last living member of her royal family, was stranded in the heart of the war zone. A fragile alien girl, no older than 20, she held the key to a power the galaxy had never seen. Her people had been wiped out, their planet destroyed by a merciless enemy. But Yara survived, hidden away in the ruins, waiting for rescue. And that's where Elias and his team came in. The Galactic Alliance had chosen Elias for this mission. He was known for his courage, his ability to lead men through the toughest situations. But this was different. He wasn't rescuing a soldier, a comrade, or an ally. He was going after someone completely unknown, someone who wasn't even human. And she wasn't just any alien, she was royalty. Yara's people, the Sireni, were unlike any species Elias had ever encountered. Their bodies were delicate, their skin translucent, shimmering faintly like moonlight. Their culture was peaceful, focused on healing and diplomacy. It was hard to imagine such a fragile species surviving in a galaxy full of war. But Elias knew that Yara's survival meant something much larger. If she could be found and brought to safety, she might be the last hope for peace between the warring factions. "Captain," a voice interrupted his thoughts. It was Sergeant Lydia Hayes, his second in command. She walked into the dimly lit room, her face tense but determined. "We're approaching the drop zone. You'll need to get ready." Elias nodded, standing up from his seat. His leather jacket creaked as he adjusted his gear. The mission had been briefed to him in the coldest terms possible. He knew that time was against them. The enemy had already started searching for Yara, and if they found her first, there would be no hope left. "For the Sireni, you ready?" Elias asked Lydia, his voice calm but filled with an edge of uncertainty. She gave him a sharp nod. "Always." Elias turned and walked toward the airlock, his boots clicking softly against the metal floor. Behind him, his team was preparing, checking their weapons and suits. They were the best, trained for extreme conditions, capable of navigating hostile environments. But even the best soldiers couldn't predict the dangers they were about to face. The doors hissed open, and Elias stepped into the cold, harsh winds of the planet's surface. The ship above them disappeared into the clouds, leaving them alone in the wasteland. He adjusted his rifle, his grip steady as he surveyed the desolate landscape. The war zone stretched for miles, a twisted wasteland of wrecked buildings, craters, and smoldering ruins. The ground was uneven, pockmarked with explosions, and the air smelled of smoke and burning metal. Elias had seen worse, but there was something about this place that felt different. The very earth seemed to be scarred by the violence that had raged here for so long. The team moved quickly, using the ruins for cover as they advanced toward the city where Yara was believed to be hiding. Elias had studied the intelligence reports, but nothing could have prepared him for the reality of the place. The enemy had been relentless in their pursuit of the Sireni, and they had left nothing but devastation in their wake. Lydia's voice came through his comm. "Captain, we're not alone here. The enemy's patrols are close." Elias glanced at his map, calculating the quickest route to the target location. They needed to move fast. The longer they stayed exposed, the higher the chances of enemy detection. He motioned for his team to stay low and follow him, his mind racing through all the possible dangers that lay ahead. They crossed a ruined bridge, the structure barely holding together. The sound of distant explosions echoed in the background, sending dust into the air. Elias's heart rate quickened as they neared the city's edge. Yara was somewhere in that maze of destroyed buildings. If they didn't find her soon, the mission would become a suicide run. As they approached the outskirts of the city, the faintest movement caught Elias's eye. A shadow darted between two ruined buildings. He held up his hand to stop the team, signaling them to take cover. They crouched behind the remains of a collapsed wall, weapons raised. "What is it?" Lydia whispered, her eyes scanning the area. "I saw something," Stay sharp, Elias replied, his voice barely audible. They waited, silent, listening for any sign of movement. The air was thick with tension. Every sound seemed amplified in the stillness, and Elias's senses were on high alert. Then a soft cry broke the silence. It was faint, almost lost in the wind, but it was there, the sound of someone in pain. Elias motioned for Lydia to stay close as he moved toward the source of the sound. His heart raced as they crept forward, his every step measured and silent. The buildings ahead were in ruins, crumbling under the weight of past destruction. There was no sign of movement at first, but then, there. A figure, small and frail, huddled behind a pile of debris. Elias's breath caught in his throat. It was her, Yara. She looked like a ghost. Her skin was pale, her body trembling from the cold and fear. Her long, silver hair was matted with dirt, her delicate features streaked with tears. She was crouched low to the ground, barely able to lift her head, as if the weight of her own existence was too much to bear. Elias stepped forward, his hand outstretched. Yara, he called softly, his voice steady but gentle. Her head snapped up, her wide, terrified eyes locking onto his. For a moment they just stared at each other, two strangers from different worlds brought together by fate. Then Yara let out a soft, strangled sob, her body collapsing into Elias's arms as if all the strength had drained from her. Elias held her, his heart pounding in his chest. He could feel the weight of the mission bearing down on him. He had come here to save her, but he never expected to feel this deep, aching responsibility for someone so fragile, so broken. He had faced countless dangers, but nothing compared to the weight of this moment. "We're getting you out of here," Elias said, his voice firm. He gently lifted her into his arms, her body light, but trembling. "You're safe now." But even as he spoke the words, he knew the danger wasn't over. The Warzone was still alive with conflict, and their enemies were closing in. Time was running out. Elias had to move fast, before they became the next target. The weight of Yara in his arms felt heavier with each passing step. Elias tried not to think about the dangers surrounding them. The city had once been a thriving hub, a testament to the serenity of her people. Now, it was little more than a battlefield, filled with broken buildings and the smoke of distant explosions. But Elias focused on one thing, keeping Yara safe. She shivered in his arms, her fragile body trembling with fear, exhaustion, and the cold. Elias had wrapped her in his cloak, trying to shield her from the brutal wind. She had barely spoken since he found her, her silence more disturbing than any words she could have spoken. Lydia walked beside him, her eyes scanning the horizon, her rifle ready in her hands. The rest of the team followed closely behind, each of them on high alert. The mission had shifted the moment Elias found Yara. It was no longer just a rescue mission, it was a race against time. "You think they'll come for her?" Lydia whispered, as they moved through the ruined streets, her voice barely audible over the wind. "They already are," Elias said quietly. "We've got to get her to the extraction point before they realize she's gone." The team moved with military precision, weaving through the ruined city. Elias was no stranger to dangerous missions, but this felt different. Every moment, every step, felt like a countdown to something that could end in disaster. He had a duty, to his team, to Yara, but the weight of it all pressed down on him like never before. Yara's head rested against Elias's shoulder. She was so light, so delicate, it felt as though she might break at any moment. The knowledge that her entire species had been wiped out left a heavy mark on his conscience. He could see the fear in her eyes, the silent grief of losing everything she had ever known. Elias could only imagine what it must feel like to be the last of a species. The Scifi were known for their peaceful ways, their commitment to healing and diplomacy. Yara's people had always been seen as a symbol of hope in a galaxy consumed by war. But now there was only Yara, alone in the ashes of her world. "We're almost there," Elias said, his voice steady. "Stay close, everyone." The team moved forward, checking their surroundings, eyes sharp. They were nearing the outskirts of the city, where the safe zone was supposed to be located. But there were no guarantees. The enemy could be anywhere, and they had to be ready for anything. A distant rumble shook the ground beneath them. Elias didn't need to look to know that it was another explosion. The war was still raging, even if they were deep in enemy territory. Every moment they spent here brought them closer to being trapped. Suddenly, a loud crack broke the air, followed by a burst of gunfire. Elias immediately dropped to a crouch, pulling Yara down with him. His heart raced as the sound of the enemy's voices grew louder. "Ambush!" Lydia shouted, signaling for the team to take cover. Elias's eyes darted around the ruined streets, searching for a safe spot. They had no choice but to fight their way through. He pushed Yara behind a pile of rubble, his hand over her head to shield her. Her eyes widened in fear as she clung to him. "Stay, H." The extraction point was just ahead, but Elias felt no relief. Every step brought him closer to safety, but also deeper into the heart of danger. The air was thick with dust, the sky an angry shade of red as explosions lit up the horizon. There was no telling how much longer they had before the enemy regrouped and came after them. He needed to keep moving, but Yara's fragile form in his arms made every step a challenge. The extraction shuttle was still a few minutes away, hovering just beyond the crumbling ruins that marked the city's edge. Elias could hear the faint hum of its engines, but he knew it wasn't close enough yet. They had to hold out just a little longer. His team moved cautiously, taking cover behind collapsed buildings and debris. Every corner they rounded, every street they crossed, Elias expected an enemy patrol to ambush them. The feeling of being hunted was palpable. Yara, her head resting against Elias's chest, was eerily silent. She had not spoken much since they'd first met, but now there was a strange stillness about her. Her body, though light, felt fragile in his arms. Elias had grown accustomed to the weight of weapons and armor, but carrying her was different. She wasn't just a person to be protected. She was the last of her kind. He could feel the weight of her loss, her pain, in every step he took. "Stay close," Elias whispered to his team. "We've got one chance to get this right." Lydia nodded, her rifle at the ready, scanning their surroundings with sharp eyes. The rest of the team followed closely, each of them aware that the next few minutes could be their last. The war zone was unforgiving, and the enemy was ruthless. But Elias had no choice but to trust in his team's training. They continued through the ruins, making their way toward the shuttle. Elias's heart beat louder in his chest, each thump echoing in his ears. He could see the shuttle in the distance now, its engines glowing faintly as it hovered just above the ground. They were almost there. But as they rounded another corner, the sound of footsteps behind them made his blood run cold. "Ambush!" Lydia shouted, her voice urgent. Elias spun around, his hand instinctively reaching for his weapon. But it was too late. A group of enemy soldiers, heavily armed and clad in black armor, appeared from the shadows, their rifles raised. They had been waiting for this moment, knowing exactly where the human team would go. Without thinking, Elias dropped Yara to the ground behind a nearby column, pulling his rifle from its holster. The rest of the team quickly followed suit, taking up defensive positions. The enemy was coming fast, too fast. They were trapped. "Get to cover," Elias ordered, his voice sharp. He fired a few rounds, his rifle's report loud in the stillness of the war zone. The enemy returned fire, their shots hitting the walls and columns around them. Elias could hear the whiz of bullets passing by, each one a reminder of how close they were to death. His heart raced, but his focus remained sharp. He had a mission: protect Yara, get her to safety. He couldn't let anything distract him from that. "Lydia," Elias called, his eyes scanning the enemy positions. "Flank them from the left. We need to move now." Lydia nodded, signaling the rest of the team. They moved as one, a well-coordinated unit. But the enemy wasn't backing down. They were relentless, charging forward with all the firepower they had. Elias had no choice but to keep firing, his shots finding their marks. The enemy soldiers fell one by one, but there were too many of them. And Yara, fragile, innocent Yara, was still behind cover, vulnerable. Elias's mind raced as he fired another round, his heart pounding in his chest. He couldn't afford to lose her. Not now. He had promised to protect her, and he would not break that promise. "Lydia," Elias shouted again. Now! Lydia and the team moved with precision, flanking the enemy from the side. They caught the soldiers off guard, their shots landing with deadly accuracy. But the enemy wasn't finished. More soldiers appeared, pushing forward with reinforcements. Elias could see the determination in their eyes, the desperation to capture Yara. But Elias wouldn't let them. He fired again and again, his hands steady as he aimed at each soldier that came into view. The sounds of battle were deafening, but through it all, Elias's focus remained unshakable. Finally, the enemy began to retreat, their soldiers pulling back into the shadows of the ruined city. Elias kept his rifle trained on them, his finger hovering over the trigger. But he didn't fire. He knew they had bought themselves some time, but not much. "We've got to move," Elias said, his voice tight. "Now." The team quickly regrouped, moving to Yara's position. She had stayed hidden, her face pale and her body trembling, but she was still alive. Elias's heart skipped a beat when he saw her, and for a moment, he let himself breathe. "Yara," Elias said softly, kneeling beside her. "We're not safe yet, but we're almost there." She looked up at him, her eyes filled with gratitude and fear. She didn't speak, but Elias could see the silent thanks in her gaze. She was scared, but she trusted him. He had kept his promise to protect her so far, and he wasn't about to stop now. Lydia's voice crackled through the comms. "Extraction shuttles here, we've got one shot to make it, move fast." Elias nodded, lifting Yara back into his arms. The shuttle was only a few hundred yards away, hovering just above the debris. They had to make it there before the enemy returned in full force. But as Elias moved toward the shuttle, something caught his eye. Movement, just beyond the rubble. He stopped in his tracks, his senses on high alert. It was another group of enemy soldiers, closing in on their position from the other side. They were coming fast, too fast. "Run!" Elias shouted, his voice filled with urgency. Lydia and the team opened fire, covering them as Elias sprinted toward the shuttle. His heart raced in his chest, each step a desperate plea for survival. The shuttle's engines roared louder now, the sound of salvation. But it was still too far. The enemy was closing in, their footsteps growing louder. Elias pushed himself harder, his body aching with the effort. Yara's weight in his arms seemed to grow heavier with every step, but he refused to stop. He couldn't stop. Not when she was depending on him. The enemy soldiers opened fire, their shots narrowly missing Elias and his team. The sound of gunfire was deafening, but Elias kept his eyes on the shuttle. They were so close. So close. And then a voice broke through the chaos. "Elias, move!" It was Lydia. She had already reached the shuttle, her rifle raised, covering the team's retreat. Elias reached the shuttle just as the first wave of enemy fire hit the ground around him. He ducked into the open door, his heart racing as he pulled Yara inside. The shuttle's door slammed shut behind them, and the engines roared to life. They were finally safe. Elias sank into a seat, his body trembling with exhaustion. He looked down at Yara, her pale face still filled with fear but also relief. They had made it. The shuttle lifted into the air, the war zone below shrinking as they ascended. But Elias didn't feel the relief he thought he would. His mind was still focused on the danger they had just escaped, and the dangers that lay ahead. The war was far from over, and they weren't out of danger yet. But for now they were alive. They had made it out of the heart of the war zone, and that was all that mattered. The shuttle shook as it climbed higher, leaving the devastation of the war zone behind. Elias held Yara close, her fragile form nestled against him, her body still trembling. The team sat quietly around them, their eyes scanning the view outside, alert to any signs of danger. For now, they were safe, but Elias knew it wouldn't last long. The enemy wouldn't give up so easily. They had made it through one battle, but the war was far from over. The shuttle rose above the city, the landscape of destruction growing smaller below them. Elias allowed himself a moment of relief, but only a moment. The battle had taken its toll on him. His muscles ached from the constant tension and his mind was clouded with the weight of responsibility. He had promised to protect Yara, to get her to safety. But now, as they soared above the war zone, he couldn't shake the feeling that the hardest part of the journey was just beginning. The sound of the shuttle's engines was a constant hum in the background, a reminder that they were leaving the hellish city behind. Elias glanced at his team, each one of them exhausted but determined. They had done their job, but they knew there was more ahead. The extraction point was just the first step in what would be a long, dangerous journey. Yara stirred in his arms, her soft breath warm against his chest. Elias looked down at her, her delicate features still pale, her eyes closed as if she were sleeping. But he knew she wasn't asleep. She hadn't said a word since they had boarded the shuttle, her silence heavy with emotion. Elias could feel her pain, the loss of her people, the weight of being the last of her kind. She was a survivor, but that didn't make the burden any easier to carry. He gently adjusted his grip on her, trying to make her more comfortable. The journey ahead would take time and they needed to get as far from the war zone as possible. The shuttle was fast, but it could only go so far before it needed to refuel. They would need to stop, to rest, to regroup, and they couldn't afford to stay in one place for too long. The enemy would be searching for them, hunting them down. As if reading his thoughts, Lydia spoke up from across the shuttle. "Captain, we've got a problem." Elias turned his head, his eyes narrowing. Lydia had always been the calm one, always thinking ahead. If she was concerned, it was serious. "What's the situation?" Elias asked. The shuttle's warning lights blinked wildly as the damage to the rear engine took its toll. The explosion had rocked the vessel, throwing them off course. Elias's heart sank as he gripped the seat in front of him, the faint sound of alarms ringing through the cabin. The shuttle shuddered under the strain, struggling to maintain altitude. "We've been hit," Lydia called out, her voice tight with urgency. "We're losing power." Elias's mind raced as he looked over at Yara. She was still curled up in his arms, her body tense with fear, but her eyes wide with uncertainty. He had promised to protect her, but now, with the enemy closing in, it felt like everything was slipping out of his control. "Lydia, can you stabilize the flight path?" Elias demanded, his voice steady despite the panic that threatened to rise inside him. "I'll try," Lydia replied, fingers flying over the control panel. "But the damage is extensive. We're not going to make it far like this." Elias knew she was right. The shuttle's systems were failing faster than they could react. The enemy ship, now close enough to fire on them directly, was relentless. They couldn't outrun it, not in this condition. "Captain," one of the team members, Sergeant Carter, shouted from the rear. "The enemy ship's locking on." Elias's stomach churned. The enemy wasn't just trying to stop them, they were trying to destroy them. "Everyone, hold on!" Elias yelled, his voice carrying authority, though his heart pounded in his chest. He needed a plan, and fast. They couldn't outrun the enemy, and they couldn't keep flying with the shuttle's engine in this condition. But there was a small chance, just a small one, that they could make it. The asteroid field they had just passed was still within range, and the enemy ship's firepower had to be weakened by the proximity to the dense rocks. "Lydia, take us back into the asteroid field," Elias ordered, his eyes narrowing as he looked at the trajectory. "We've got one shot to lose them." Lydia glanced at him, her face strained, but she didn't hesitate. She spun the shuttle back toward the asteroid field, the shuttle's engines groaning with the effort. The sudden shift in direction made Yara shift in Elias's arms, her eyes flickering open, fear visible on her face. "I don't know how much longer we can keep this up," Lydia said, her voice filled with worry as she adjusted the shuttle's course. "They're gaining on us." "We don't have a choice," Elias replied firmly. "We keep moving. We keep fighting." The shuttle plunged back into the asteroid field, the rocky debris surrounding them like a maze. The enemy ship followed, close behind, firing laser blasts that narrowly missed them, sending chunks of rock flying as they wove between the floating obstacles. The shuttle's engines groaned in protest, but they kept moving. The tension inside the shuttle was unbearable. Elias's heart was racing, But his mind was clear. He had to keep his team together. He had to keep Yara safe. But as they weaved between asteroids, Elias couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. And then, in the midst of the chaos, something unexpected happened. A sudden explosion rocked the shuttle, this time from within. The entire ship jolted, throwing everyone forward. Elias barely managed to hold on to Yara, who let out a terrified cry. The shuttle's engines sputtered, and the control panels flickered. For a moment, everything seemed to slow down. Elias's eyes widened. The explosion hadn't come from the enemy ship. It had come from inside the shuttle. He looked over at Lydia, who was struggling to keep control of the ship, her face pale with shock. What the hell happened? Elias demanded, panic creeping into his voice. Lydia was breathing hard, her hands gripping the controls. "There's a sabotage," she said, her voice shaking. "The fuel lines. Someone tampered with them." Elias's stomach dropped. The fuel lines? That meant someone on their own team had sabotaged the shuttle. It was the only explanation. But the question was, who? He looked around the cabin, his eyes scanning the faces of his team. Everyone was still there, except for one person. Sergeant. "Carter." "Carter," Elias said, his voice like ice. "Where's Carter?" Lydia's eyes darted around, her expression filled with confusion. "He was in the back. He was helping secure the supplies. I don't..." But Elias didn't need to hear more. He knew. The betrayal was clear now. He stood up, carefully lowering Yara to the seat beside him, and moved toward the rear of the shuttle. The rest of the team followed, weapons drawn, ready for whatever they might find. As Elias reached the back, he saw it. Sergeant Carter was standing by the fuel compartment, his back turned. He was holding a small device in his hands, a grin on his face. The smug look disappeared as soon as he saw Elias. "What did you do?" Elias demanded, his voice filled with fury. Carter held up his hands in mock surrender. "It's nothing personal, Captain," he said, his voice calm and cold. "I'm just doing what needs to be done. This mission is over." Elias's mind raced. Carter was a traitor. But why? What had driven him to sabotage the mission, to put them all in danger? He had been a loyal soldier, one of the best. Or so Elias had thought. "You're working for the enemy?" Elias asked, his voice low. Carter smirked. "No, I'm working for myself. This is bigger than any war. Yara's worth a lot more than you think. And now she's mine. She's a bargaining chip." The words hit Elias like a punch to the gut. Carter had never been loyal. Not really. He had always been looking for a way out, a way to profit from the chaos. But Yara wasn't a bargaining chip. She wasn't a tool to be used in some twisted game. Elias took a step forward, his voice cold with anger. "You won't get away with this." Carter raised the device in his hand, a detonator. Elias's blood ran cold. Carter had planned this. All along, he had intended to destroy the shuttle, kill them all, and take Yara for himself. Elias didn't wait another second. He lunged at Carter, knocking the detonator from his hand. The device fell to the floor with a loud clatter. Elias slammed Carter against the wall, his fists landing with precise force. Carter struggled, but Elias had the advantage. His anger fueled his strength as he pinned the traitor to the wall. "You're not going to ruin this," Elias snarled, his voice filled with raw emotion. For a moment, they locked eyes. Carter's filled with cold indifference, Elias's with a fire that would not be extinguished. The shuttle shuddered again, the lights flickering as the damage from the sabotage took its toll. But then, something shifted. Carter's smirk faded as he realized that he had lost. The enemy wasn't going to get what they wanted, and neither was he. With a final push, Elias shoved Carter to the ground, securing him with handcuffs. The team moved in, taking control of the situation. Lydia, who had been watching, now stepped forward, her face pale but determined. "Captain, we need to get out of here," she said urgently. "The shuttle's systems are failing fast." Elias nodded, breathing heavily, but his focus remained sharp. He had dealt with the betrayal, but now was not the time to grieve it. They still had a mission to complete. He turned to Yara, who was sitting quietly, her wide eyes watching everything unfold. She was terrified. Of the war, of the betrayal, of everything. But Elias knew she would survive. She had already survived so much. "We're not finished yet," Elias said softly, his voice filled with determination. "We get to that station. We finish this." But as he spoke, he knew the hardest part was yet to come. The journey ahead would be even more dangerous. And the enemy, those who wanted Yara for their own purposes, were only just beginning to close in. The shuttle shuddered again, its systems failing faster than anyone could react. The sabotage had taken its toll, and the fuel leak was spreading. Elias could feel the tension in the air as the crew scrambled to make repairs. But it was clear. The shuttle wasn't going to last much longer. The enemy ship was still following them, relentless and determined. They needed to get to the station. They needed to finish this. Elias stood over Carter, who was now tied up in the corner of the shuttle. His face was bloodied from the fight, but the traitor's eyes were filled with nothing but cold indifference. Carter had been a trusted member of the team, but now Elias could see the truth. There was no loyalty in him, only self-interest. He had sold them out for a chance at profit, and it had almost cost them everything. Lydia was at the controls, her hands moving over the console with precision. "We're almost there," she said, her voice tense. "But we're not going to make it there undetected. The enemy's ship is still closing in." Elias walked over to her, his eyes scanning the readings. The refueling station was just ahead, but the enemy ship was closing in fast. They were running out of time, and the shuttle's damage meant they couldn't outrun them much longer. "Do we have any weapons left?" Elias asked, his voice low. Lydia glanced at him, her eyes filled with determination. "We've got a few blasts left in the rear guns, but they won't hold up for long. The enemy ship is too powerful." Elias clenched his fists. They couldn't afford to fight the enemy head-on, not with a damaged shuttle and a traitor on board. But they couldn't let the enemy capture Yara, not after everything they had been through. "Get us to that station," Elias ordered. "I'll hold them off as best as I can." Lydia nodded, her expression hardening. "You've got it." The shuttle lurched forward again, picking up speed as it neared the refueling station. Elias could see the large metallic platform floating just ahead, its lights flickering in the distance. They were so close. But the enemy ship was still there, and they weren't giving up. As the shuttle raced toward the station, Elias felt his heart